Don't have much to say about this one, but I know that I'm going to get some hackles. So let's just go and drop the bombshell first, and then I'll try to build up my point. This is going on the skip list for me. I didn't really like it. Watching through the episode was just weird and uncomfortable. And I hope I'm going to try and explain why as we go through this. First, this was written by Judy Burns and her husband, Chet Richards, their only contribution to Star Trek. And she actually read the writer's guide, which is astonishing. But also, her original script called for Spock to be the one on the other side. Now, that's kind of critical because Spock and McCoy have the only major character interaction in this entire episode. So that involved a substantial rewrite to shift it around, right? Keep that in mind. She also originally wanted there to be like a belt, which was providing the environmental control rather than an actual environmental suit, which not only would save a lot of money, but probably, frankly, would have looked a little bit better. No offense to the suit. It was, Theis and Mike Miner who put together the suit. And it's a good-looking suit. It's just the ghost scenes kind of suffered a little bit from it as a direct consequence. I also think, personally, that the idea of saving money on that might have been a better idea, since they were already blowing over $90,000 on the visual effects of this episode because of the Tholians and the web and the Defiant, the Vanishing, and the Vanished Kirk and all that. So they were already kind of stretched on this one. Now, this episode was directed by Sinensky. This was the last episode directed by Sinensky. This is his final outing, and the final of the big three. We've already lost Daniels. We lost him earlier, Mark Daniels. And we lost Pevney back in Season 2. And whatever you may say about both of them, they knew how to direct decent episodes, and so did Sinensky. All three of them had a good style to them. And this is the really strange part. Sinensky was fired in mid-production of this episode because he was going over on his time. Now, maybe I'm a weirdo, but if someone goes over on their time budget, maybe you should consider firing them. If you want to fire them, because, corporate mandate, maybe you should fire them after they finish the episode, rather than bringing in some new guy out of nowhere who's never directed Trek before to finish up what's left. Just a thought. Either way, that's it. That's the end for Sinensky, Pevney, and Daniels. At this point, the only person really left, not counting crew members of the original major contributors to the show, is Justman. And he will be leaving later on in Season 3, so that's great. Either way, this is a first. In fact, it's technically a second first, but the big first is this is the first introduction of the Tholians. The Tholians are added to the show and will only show up in, I think, one other episode ever. Which is a damn shame. I actually really like the idea of the Tholians and what they are, and I suppose I'll talk about the Tholians now, because the Tholians don't have much in show. Like, they're referenced a few times, and they're seen in the 2 episodes, and to my knowledge, that's it. Most of my knowledge and interest in the Tholians comes from other works, the games or the books or whatever. But I always found the Tholians fascinating, the assembly. Ignoring the fact that they're, bug crystalline entities who exist in super death heat, which is kind of neat and makes them a little bit more alien, which, I'm down for a little bit more alien. I'm with it. We also have the fact, and this is not codified lore, I want to be clear, this is not canon to my knowledge, but the idea has been posited that they are a multidimensional empire. Now, to make sure I'm explaining myself clearly there, because I've mentioned this before and a few people just looked at me weird, what I mean by that is, if you think of an interplanetary empire as an empire that controls many planets, an interdimensional empire is one that controls space across multiple dimensions. In short, the idea being that every Tholian we interact with across the dimensions is part of the same organization. This neatly explains several things, not the least of which why they would know to go check on the Defiant over in Mirror Darkly, but also why they would be so interested in taking and claiming this area of space, which by most accounts is very dangerous, since there's the dimensions, the barriers between dimensions are so weak here. But you can see why that would be so valuable to them. It would be like claiming a chunk of terrain that's just perfect for a natural road, or maybe a long river which allows for travel up and down it, Because at this point, that's just a super bonus for them. Just food for thought. And like I said, I like the idea of the Tholians too, because diplomatically they're binary but fair. Like, in this very episode, Spock's like, listen, we're looking for this other ship, and it's and the Tholian's like, okay. The Tholian, who's voiced by Trelane's mom, obviously, she's like, yeah, sure, no, I'll give you a chance to prove this. Once it's proven that you are lying, however, I'm going to kill you. That's what I mean by binary. It is very all or none with them. Like, I could actually picture a scenario where a wounded ship is trying to get to a starbase, and that means crossing through Tholian territory for whatever reason. So they're like, ugh, and the Tholians are like, what are you doing? And we're like, we need to get there. And they're like, okay, it looks like you're telling the truth. We're going to send an escort with you. And then they escort you, and you go through the territory, and you get there, and you get repairs, and you're fine. No issues. But the reason they send the escort is because if you're lying or this is a trick or whatever, well, then they're going to kill you. There's something just refreshingly honest about that. I don't know. It's very enjoyable. Which is good, because this episode certainly wasn't. I'm sorry. Let me jump into some of the whys. First of all, we get to the Defiant ship, and there's no record of mutiny ever. In the interest of total fairness, going by my rules of only what we've established up till this episode, there's only been a couple of instances of not quite mutiny up till now. The one with Spock, which doesn't really count, and the bit with the crew. I actually don't remember the name of that episode, but you know the one I'm talking about. None of that counts, really, and obviously Discovery hasn't been invented yet, and Whom Gods Destroy hasn't come out yet. Even though Who Gods Destroy says that there was a mutiny before this episode, it doesn't count in the continuity because it hasn't happened yet, so, okay, by our own rules, I'll give you that, Spock. So everyone on board has killed each other because they're wigging out, and we get to the first weird part of the script, where the transporter breaks when trying to beam them back. Why? There's no issues at the end of the episode, and in fact, none of the rest of the ship has any problem whatsoever adapting. They mentioned that, oh, it's being ripped apart by the dimensional space, but again, none of the rest of the ship has any of those real problems. It's just this one instance where they need to make sure that someone gets left behind. I mean, think about that. It's so specific that only one person gets left behind. Come on. Anyways, I'm willing to forgive that, though. And the Defiant winks out of existence. Bye, Defiant. I'll see you in Enterprise. Bye. This then leads to Chekhov losing it on the bridge. And notice he gets irritable just a little bit first. I want you to remember that. And why don't they keep phasers on the bridge? Like, you'd think that would be a normal thing that would actually be really helpful for, standard operations. Being able to... Someone wigs out on the bridge, or gets controlled, or an alien invades, and you have a stun setting. Anyways. So, Chekhov wigs out, okay. And the Tholians finally show up. I already mentioned that. First introduction of the Tholians to the series. It just occurred to me, the two ships named Defiant in Star Trek have both been big changes to the setting. You think about that? No, seriously. This episode is actually a landmark episode in how much it alters so much of history of Star Trek, because almost all of the Mirror Universe will be demonstrably altered by this episode. And, of course, it's by a ship, the Defiant, because, anyway. So the Tholians show up. They mention what I mentioned. And this leads to some weirdness. First of all, there's a lot of weird little details. I decided to only write down two to really explain my point. There's this bit where they're hit by the Tholian ship, and they go, and then Spock says, emergency power to shields, even draining the phasers. They're like, okay, and then the next ship is this huge hit that actually damages the ship. Why? The next quote I want to share with you is later on, McCoy is trying to find a cure, or more accurately, an inoculation for, actually, is that really the right word? Whatever. For this death doom stuff that's affecting their brain. So he's gotten to the point where he knows the exact compound he wants to use and mix with something. He just isn't sure what to mix it with. So when asked if he's any closer to a cure, he says no. Then he immediately after that says, but I know it has to do with mixing this one compound, which I didn't write down the name, so don't ask me to mention it. Now, you could argue that means he's not any closer, since he's got to mix it with a whole bunch of things, but he's pretty close to a cure at that point, so I'm not sure why he says that. And there's just a lot of weird parts of the script that don't really line up and don't make perfect sense, both with the scene they're in and the other scenes of the episode. And that's my point. There's a really big one coming up, and I'll mention it in just a second, but this episode feels disjointed as hell. And I don't know if it's because of the writing. I don't know if it's because of the director change in the middle. Remember I mentioned that? I don't know if it's because the script was massively rewritten. Remember I mentioned the Spock to Kirk thing? And I don't know if it's because of the fact that they had script editing issues at this point in Star Trek in general, which I've mentioned before. It could also be all of these things, or any combination thereof. I don't know. To be 100% clear, I walked into this episode expecting to like it. No, really, this is my first episode I covered today. I was excited. And I was eating breakfast, like, oh, I get to cover Tholian Web. This is going to be awesome. And then I'd sit down, and it's just, what? And I expect a lot of you will disagree with me in comments, and that's fine. Because I expected to like this episode, too. Does anybody else have anything else to add to this? I'm very curious. Anybody who either agrees with me or disagrees with me, and most importantly, why? Why? This leads me to my biggest problem with the episode. The McCoy and Spock stuff. Now, I'm willing to forgive a little bit of it. Only a little bit. Because the idea, as presented, is that McCoy is slowly losing it because of the effects of the space-time thing. Here's the catch, though. Most of the time, when someone loses it because of the space-time thing, they show signs of being more aggressive and angry. Basically just being irritable. And then they go nuts. Like, seconds, if not a minute later. But McCoy is irritable and ornery for, in lore, a little over 2 hours. And yet, this whole time, he's just kind of being ornery and irritable to Spock to a severe extent. In fact, the only time that it actually shows any indication that he's being affected by the interspatial stuff is the second time he confronts Spock loudly on the bridge, questioning him. Which, as I've already pointed out earlier in The Ultimate Computer, is a very rude thing to do, and also a legitimate breach of protocol. Now, I know this is McCoy, but what? And notice, this is the second time he does this in this episode. The two butt heads constantly. And the tone is just all over the place. Like the funeral scene, right? With a bunch of people just standing with no solidarity whatsoever in how they're standing. That just might be an extras problem. And then in the middle of this scene where they're not even... There's no proper usage of music. The dialogue Spock is saying is just weird and doesn't really line up with the feel of it. And then you have one guy just randomly lose it in the middle and be dragged out screaming, and then McCoy decides to charge down Spock's throat again. Then we have the scene where they confront each other in Kirk's room. And McCoy really goes after Spock here. In fact, no less than 5 times that I counted, I'm pretty sure I missed a few, he actively attacks Spock over, "You just wanted command. You've always just wanted to be in charge." What? None of this lines up for me. It feels like if I were to try and give a vague, not really codified feeling of how the episode feels, it feels to me like what I'm watching is multiple scripts that have been glued together into one episode. And so the inconsistency is the fact that I am effectively watching multiple episodes being acted by the same characters at the same time in the same way, and that creates the inconsistency. That's what it feels like to me. I don't know. Like I said, I did whatever research I could, and I didn't find much. It is also possible, by the way, just to mention this for historical purposes, it's also possible that this is when the big confrontation between Shatner, Nimoy, Friedberger, and Roddenberry happened, which was something that happened sometime in Season 3. I'm not sure exactly when, so forgive me. And what it boiled down to was... Shatner and Nimoy both demanded to know who is the star of the show, which I admit I don't understand, and frankly I don't even really get why that's a thing, but I don't have the ego of an actor because I don't have the qualifications to be an actor, so maybe I just don't get it at all. Either way, that was a big confrontation, and Friedberger was just waffling because he didn't know. So Friedberger pulled in Roddenberry and forced Roddenberry point blank to answer, like, okay, what is this? Who is the actual star? Roddenberry, by accounts, was very pissed at having to give an answer because he didn't want to. And to be perfectly blunt, that sounds a lot like the Roddenberry I have come to learn about as I've been going through this. How do I phrase this? He's the kind of person who doesn't like to play hardball with people. He prefers to smile and nod and say, it's okay, don't worry about it, and be very, very non-confrontational, right? That's not an insult, by the way. It's just, when you're the mainliner of a show, that's a problem, because you need to be the kind of person who can confront someone and lay down the law and be that iron wall and all the other things that you need to be when you're in charge, which Roddenberry just really didn't like to do. I've had theories for years that Meislish, his attorney, was his element, his tool of that's how he would be the boss, is through the attorney, which would partially explain why so many people are also willing to throw Meislish under the bus singularly, as if blaming everything 100% on him, right? Because he was the fall guy, right? He was the bad cop, and Roddenberry was the good cop. By the way, Roddenberry was actually a cop, so at least I think he was. I shouldn't say that without knowing with total certainty. I'm pretty sure I have read that he is a cop. Let me preface that. Let me say that a little more clearly. Either way, and I'm not saying that as a derogatory, I'm just saying he might be aware of those kinds of psychological tactics. That's all I meant by that statement. Either way, this episode and this confrontation is just because McCoy flat out attacks Spock over this whole scene. And then there's this big thing where Kirk gives this speech about how you should rely on each other and you're both awesome. And then McCoy apologizes and Spock apologizes and they reconcile and they do better from that point on. Why? You remember Amok Time? Because I do. It's a great episode. It's one of my favorite episodes. In fact, if I were to look at my list here, yep, Amok Time is on the top of my list. Very top. Way up there. And so far, that's staying true. And frankly, I don't see anything in Season 3 is going to break that. Especially since we're already past Enterprise Incident, which is the one I remember being pretty good from Season 3. But anyways, so, great episode, right? You remember how Spock asked McCoy to be there present for this extremely emotional, powerful, shameful event? You remember that? You remember how that really showed how close the two were? You remember how we've seen how close of a friendship the two have up until now? It came up even in Bread and Circuses, which was just kind of an episode, but there was still a great scene between Spock and McCoy showing how close the two had become and how much they understood each other. Are you honestly trying to tell me that this is the attitude and opinion they should have here? No, let me tell you what I think of this scene. And then I'd love to hear your thoughts, or I guess read your thoughts. You know what I mean. Season 1, Episode 2. That's what this feels like to me. Now, I gotta explain that, because that doesn't really get it across. Imagine Season 1, Episode 1. Captain Pike, First Officer Kirk. Everyone else is there. And then, at the end, or towards the end of the episode, Pike dies. Lays down his life to save the ship. Kind of similar to how people died over in Voyager's Caretaker, but not the exact same execution. Anyways, Pike lays down his life. See, Episode 2 comes along. Kirk and McCoy are now, for this to work, they have to not have been pre-existing friends, by the way. They've been butting heads over this. McCoy was a big friend of Pike's and is very upset about his death and is just barely handling this and is really pissed off at Kirk, who is not only wanting to take command, but McCoy knows how ambitious Kirk is, and he knows Kirk wanted this command. You're just totally cool with taking my dead friend's seat. That's all you really care about. Then they see the video, and Pike tells the two, you need to rely on each other. Kirk is a great first officer, and he's got great command instincts, and you need to trust him. And McCoy is an excellent friend who's got wonderful intuition, and the two of you will be invaluable to the running of this ship and making sure everything goes smoothly. Please learn to lean on each other, blah, 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 blah. Better written than I'm saying, because I'm making this up the top of my head. Then the two reconcile a little bit and agree to work together, and now we have the beginnings of the friendship between McCoy and Kirk. Now, obviously, none of that fits with Trek canon, but I went through that whole exercise to explain what this scene feels like, because that's what this scene feels like. Like a Season 1, Episode 2 of a show where that's necessary to help establish the status quo and get the characters interacting with each other in ways that they previously wouldn't. If I was to restructure that a bit, let's say Janeway was the first officer or science officer of Voyager, okay? And Captain dies in the transference. I've said for years that should have happened, that she shouldn't have been the captain. But let's move forward. So the captain dies, and so she assumes command, and I don't know. I guess we'd have to restructure this even more to make this fit Voyager, because the other one to fit would be Chakotay. But the point is, you can see how this format would fit as an establishing point. Not something that's being done between two long-existing friends who are part of the power trio of this particular show in Season 3. Have I made my point? I sure hope so, because I don't have much else to say about this episode. They get blown out. They have the antidote, and the Tholians are making their web, and then the solution just happens. I got to be 100% real. I'm still not 100% sure what happened. They're like, okay, we're ready. And then they, go through the rift and then exit out 2 parsecs later. I'm not 100% sure what happened, and what happened is the Tholians just sort of stopped being a problem, and the dimensional space just stops being a problem. Sure. Am I the only one wondering about the political ramifications of the Tholian assembly mentioning that, they were fired upon by a ship? Let's just move on. And then the episode's over. And we have a wah-wah moment with Kirk. Ha 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 ha. The end. I really want to hear your comments on this one, because I know this one's a rather beloved episode. In fact, the reason this is the episode that was so significant for Trek history, retroactively, is because this was a favorite of the designers over on Enterprise, and they wanted to tie it in. So they did. Feel free to tell me that I'm an idiot, although I'd prefer you give some kind of actual feedback on the why, and why you like this episode if you do. Like I said, very, very curious. Either way, I do hope you guys have enjoyed. And I guess I'll see you next time.